Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second seminar in this series on Neoclassicism, Race, and Empire. My name is Charles Kang, and I'm a curator of 18th and 19th century drawings at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I would also like to introduce my co-organizer, Brigitte van Preussen, Junior Research Fellow at Christ Church College at the University of Oxford. I'm so delighted to see so many of you joining us today from across the world. I'd like to thank everyone at Torch whose generous help made this event a reality. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll quickly outline a few practicalities. After the talk is over, Brigitte will open up the floor for discussion, and we would be grateful if you could put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I would also like to remind you that there is one more seminar in this series, so we would love you to join us again in 2 weeks' time for Louis Nelson's talk titled Neoclassicism and the Architecture of Race. Brigitte will put the registration link for these events, as well as our email addresses in the chat box. And please do get in touch with Brigitte and me with any thoughts or suggestions for future iterations of this series. Now, I'm really honored to welcome and introduce our speaker, Anne Lafont, Director of Studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where she leads a research module, Histoire de l'art and Créolité, or Art History and Creolities. As a specialist of 18th and 19th century art and visual culture in the transatlantic world, she has published groundbreaking studies on the intersections between the world of art and the world of knowledge and science, on the role of women in different art worlds, and on race and the visual culture of the Enlightenment. Her publications include L'artiste savant à la conquête du monde moderne of 2010, 1740, un abrégé du monde, savoir et collection autour de deux alliés d'Argentville of 2012, and most recently, L'art et la race, l'Africain tout contre l'œil des Lumières of 2019. Today, her talk is entitled African Art as a Product of Neoclassical Thought. Please join me in welcoming Anne Lafont. And the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Charles, and I want to thank Brigitte and Charles for the invitation and, of course, the research seminar of Oxford University. I'm very happy to present this new material and these new questions I share with them around the question of neoclassicism, race, and empire. And I decided to do something regarding theory, and I would like to share that with you today. In the context of this seminar, at the intersection of neoclassicism, race, and empire, I would like to proceed to an artificial encounter between two texts from the 1760s, in which conceptions of Africa, its objects, and history are tested in the Enlightenment debate on the philosophy of history and its universalist capacity. The project of establishing intellectual categories based on the diversity of experiences lived within empires gave way to attempts and efforts to represent Africa so that it fits into European explanations of the world. The world had been enlarged by the conquest of new territories, new trades, new knowledge, etc., requiring an intelligible ordering of this new embarrassment of riches, an order able to bring out elements common to all humanity. Also, in front of this onslaught of experiences and objects, two sciences were born: anthropology, or the philosophy basing the natural and cultural history of the human being, and aesthetics, or the philosophy basing the judgment of the sensitive and artistic experiences. In order to contextualize the emergence of anthropology and aesthetics in the 18th century, I would like to give some factual elements. First of all, it was a century of transition where anthropology and anatomy merged. But it was also a period of rapprochement between the history of religions, or comparative and cultural history, and the knowledge proper to the natural history of human being, which can be recognized in the work of Bernard Picard on the comparative history of the customs and religions of the world, which first volume was published in 1724 and the last one in 1743, and in the natural history of the Comte de Buffon. Sorry, it's not the right, oh, yes, it was not the right slide, this is the one. And in the natural history of the Comte de Buffon, which was published the first volume in 1749, and the other issues were until the beginning of the 19th century in 1804. As far as aesthetics is concerned, the parallel emergence of a discourse built around the program dates back to the publication of Aesthetica by Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten in 1750. In this work, the philosopher states the need to develop a capacity to judge good and bad art according to objectified criteria, and consequently opens the possibility of comparing and ranking what is offered to our sensibility and also to our judgment. Thus, these two disciplines were in fact attempts to draw a certain number of generalities or categorical principles from the natural and factual diversity of the world. The one by putting at the center the human being in society, and the other, the material and symbolic objects. I will try to keep this articulation of anthropology and aesthetics throughout this presentation, insofar as they found the historical discourse on Africa and its objects, and as they are actualized in the two books discussed today. The first book, du culte des dieux fétiches, du culte des dieux fétiches ou parallèle de l'ancienne religion de l'Égypte avec la religion actuelle de la négricie, was published in 1760 in French, written by the Président Charles de Brosses, a friend and interlocutor of the Comte de Buffon and Denis Diderot, whose work was divided between history and linguistics and dealt with the knowledge of Southern Islands, Italy, and the Roman Republic. On the worship of fetish gods was recently translated into English and edited by Daniel Leonard in 2017. The book has three parts. The first exposes animistic religions in Africa. The second part describes the religious world of ancient Egypt. And the third attempts, through the condemnation of African idolatry, to undermine the very idea of religion by attacking the superstitious and irrational characters of all religions. The second book is that of Johann-Joachim Winckelmann, The History of Ancient Art, and it was published in 1764, 4 years after Charles de Brosses' book. I will not return to the figure of Winckelmann, except to recall that in the introduction, he expresses very clearly the book's program, which was to break with the biographical and regional history of art in order to develop a system, and it is his term, system, based on an evolutionary scheme. Winckelmann modeled it on human life and thus configured another space of rapprochement between aesthetics and anthropology incipient. He tried to recognize and understand art in terms of cycles, including birth, maturity, and old age, or archaic, classical, and declinist styles. The history of ancient art is subdivided into several parts, some general, on the essence of art, for example, and others geographic on the art of the Egyptians, of the Etruscans, of the Persians, and the Greeks and the Romans. These two books were published a few years apart, one in French and the other in German, in the European Republic of Letters, space where ideas circulated among the educated elite of the empires. I do not claim that there was a correspondence between the two authors or any direct connection that would be the basis for a reenactment of a historical confrontation. but it seems interesting to me to place in parallel their different conceptions of Africa, its history and its objects, because they inform a space of sociability for European knowledge. Charles de Brosses. And just to say a few words, I will go and develop my arguments, and I think we can go back to the text and the excerpts I've chosen for today afterwards. So I begin with Charles de Brosses. After having drawn a portrait of African religious practices based on his readings of travel accounts, he never went to Africa, Charles de Brosses forges the notion of fetishism, a form of idolatry that places natural forces on gods, whose intermediaries are consecrated objects, and in fact endowed with protective, providing, or neutralizing powers. These intercessors are the object of care in their making and maintenance, and they provide followers with means of materially encouraging their wishes to the gods in order to attract their benevolence. De Brosses bases the definition of fetishism on a conceptual expansion of a linguistic fact. Thus, he entitles a spiritual human activity by proceeding to an increase in generality of a Portuguese term, feitiços, which means handmade, and which designated a sacred object like Nkisi. And I just showed what it was like an Nkisi. It's the one from the Fuller Art Museum, and I suppose 18th century piece. De Brosses inaugurates the material study of religion while making a genealogy of the history of African beliefs. He thus relates the ways of transmission of the ancient Egyptian religion, notably in its man-animal relationship, to the animist religion of contemporary Africa. The cult devoted to the snake in the region of Ouida in Benin, a cult that was widely echoed by travelers in the early modern period, beginning with Alfred Dapper, serves as an emblematic example. And I give this example of the Book of the Dead, which is kept at the British Museum and represents the god Nehebko, a god snake, very famous in ancient Egyptian mythology. What is implicit in his work, in the work of de Brosses, is the sacredness of certain objects, the materialism of religious practice, and the unicity of the continent through the ages. Africa is not divided by its sea extension, the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, nor cut in two by an internal desert border, the Sahara. And we will go back to how he explains it in the excerpts I have selected, and we will look at them afterwards. I go to Winckelmann. The project of Winckelmann's book was to write the history of ancient art based on the explanatory model of the evolutionary system. This system was applied to geographical entities, that means climatic entities, such as the embodied stages in a chronological and theological process. Thus, one could judge of the exceptional and superior character of Greek art in relation to Roman, Etruscan, Egyptian, or Persian art. Egyptian art was then caught in this progressive temporality whose apogee was Greek art. From this point of view, it embodied a form of primitivism and archaism in the history of figurative art, whose most remarkable level of accomplishment during the entire ancient period corresponded to Greek culture. The flatness, literally, of the Egyptian motifs, their absence of third dimension, were understood as a first stage of figuration and the sign of the limited capacity of the Egyptian manufacturers. In the geographical grouping covered by the notion of antiquity, a period that corresponds to the entry into history, there was a unity that was not continental. It was not based on a territorial continuity, but did form a political wall, the Roman Empire, with the Mediterranean Sea as a connecting space at its center. The navigation then overhung the means of transport and communication on land to form a mode of weaving of the sea banks between them, which was to configure the common space of the historical investigation led by Winckelmann. Therefore, contrary to what de Brosses' work shows, the Egypt of the history of the ancient art escapes continental Africanity, whose nature is then soiled by the contemporary slave trade and slavery on the Atlantic coast. And we can go back also in the excerpt of, with the connection of another part of sub-Saharan Africa, which is Ethiopia, which is much more connected to Egyptian part of Africa in the narrative of Winckelmann. So we have to understand how it comes that, or how it's working out in a sense that there are two kinds of sub-Saharan Africa in the conception of Winckelmann. My hypothesis is that the liberal arts promoted by Winckelmann could not suffer any proximity or any connection with enslaved Africa when liberality was understood in the sense that creation, the arts, were based on the activities of a free mind more than a manual or technical skills obtained through repetition and training of the body, qualities necessary only for the production of a craft. Liberality was also meant in the Winckelmann narrative as a political context favorable to the arts. It is difficult to determine what is the cause and what is the effect, and it is more likely the principle of a current system that holds together, on one hand, ancient Egypt, Mediterranean Bank of Africa, and Greco-Roman antiquity, and on the other hand, kept at a good distance, West Africa, Atlantic coast, and the contemporary slave trade. In the Winckelmannian construction, there is a break in continuity between the two African territories, between Egypt and the Gulf of Guinea. And this break can be understood in the following way. By this rupture, the art historian excludes a possible correspondence, even a genealogical filiation between the European liberal arts of 1760s, precisely the neoclassical arts of the academy and of modern knowledge based on the revival of ancient art, and the fetish work of contemporary African societies providing slaves. Let me explain. In order to promote the revival of ancient classicism as a result of the civilizational achievement of enlightened Europe, the Rome-based author cannot absorb the anti-clerical hypothesis of de Brosses, who makes even pagan and Christian religions by implying that ancient Egypt was an ancestor by both the clerics of Europe and the fetishists of Africa. Winckelmann makes an exceptional history of an exclusive Mediterranean artistic achievement when de Brosses refers to universal superstitious practices and draws the line of distinction between the Enlightenment and obscurantism around the break with all fetishisms, with all religions, Christian and pagan. To return to the seminar project, Neoclassicism, Race and Empire. So I have chosen to question neoclassical theory insofar as it is concerned in its elaboration with imperial and racial questions induced by the presence of African objects in Europe, presently, or in the form of illustrated or textual representations at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. So I would like to clarify what I mean by neoclassicism, given that it is confronted with the history of Africa and its objects. The neoclassicism of these two authors aims at basing the theory not only on a scholarly and genetic knowledge of ancient texts, but also on a set of natural and cultural facts that were multiplied and abundant, given the emergence of new knowledge produced on the historical level by archaeological excavations, and on the geographical level by the multiplication of travel accounts. These two facts were moreover stimulated by the increase of African objects circulating within the framework of the transatlantic imperial trade. It thus appears that the second part of the 18th century corresponds to the time when material culture, notably African, intervened in the interpretation of the world, when the transplantation of natural objects as well as artifacts and their serializations in the museum or the natural history cabinet or the curiosities cabinet imposed to make them fit into interpretative frames that were those of Europe. That may be another story. Finally, I would like to open with two questions that remained for me unanswered after having looked or studied this material. Was Africa constructed as a test of the universalist ambition of the world history of religions? And was it constructed as well as a test of the systematic, totalizing ambition of the writing of the history of ancient art? What were the resolution and what was the cost of its entry into the world history of religions and of its integration into the Winckelmannian system of the history of ancient art? And second set of questions, how do objects intervene in the racial intelligibility of the world? Does the fetish maintain itself in this otherness, in this formal heterodoxy comparable to the skin one? Or does the integration in the museum neutralize its strangeness? Does the study of African objects show that to what extent they are in step or out of step with the racialization of the world? These are my questions, and I thank you very much for listening to this talk with accent, with French accent.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that wonderful, wonderful talk. I've learned so much, and it's given me so much to think about, you know, not just about the 18th century, but also about the longer ramifications for art history as a discipline, for museums, so many issues that you've raised. I'd like to open the floor for questions for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. But while you are thinking of your questions, I know that Anne wanted to return to some specific extracts from the text that she's been discussing and to sort of go into a little bit more detail into what she's been saying with reference to the texts. So if that's okay with you, Anne, should we do that now? And please do send us your questions so that they're ready for when we've finished with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. I will share again. I'm not sure you have it. No, I will share again my screen and go to the next slide. So I just, of course, we cannot read 2 books of 500 pages in a couple of minutes, but I thought it was more fair actually to share just a couple of excerpts. So I have 2 of de Brosses and 2 of Winckelmann, and we can go further in the discussion and think of other parts of the books if you want to. So the first one, I will still read, I'm sorry with my accent, but just to make the point. So these 2 points of pagan theology, it's de Brosses in his Culte des Dieux Fétiches. These 2 points of pagan theology concern either the worship of the stars, known by the name Sabianism, or the worship, perhaps no less ancient, of certain terrestrial and material objects called fetish by the African Negroes, among whom the worship survives. For that reason, I will call it fetishism. So we have the first idea that he pretends that it is a local vocable, a local word, fetish, and an African one, and he suggests to make from it a category overarching a kind of religion practices. And he said after that, I ask that I be permitted to use this expression habitually, though In its proper signification, it refers in particular to the belief of African Negroes as signal in advance that I plan to use it equally in speaking of any other nation whatsoever, where the objects of worship are animals or inanimate beings that are divinized. So it's very interesting, first of all, to have a kind of African matrix to the encyclopedical kind of thinking and categorical thinking of the encyclopedies, to have the African matrix that will be declined in other contexts in his narrative, and also to think that the world itself at its own local agency, first of all. I will sometimes, does de Brosses say, I will sometimes use it even in talking about certain peoples for whom objects of this sort are not so much gods, properly speaking, as they are things endowed with a divine virtue, oracles, amulets, and protective talismans. So it's also interesting that by saying that at the beginning of the text, objects called fetishes by the African Negroes among whom the worship survives. So he also includes the idea of a history, of a lasting history of fetishism, and it introduces or it opens the way to the possibility of thinking the connection in between Egypt and contemporary Africa. And second excerpts, it's at the beginning of the first section. As I said, there were 3 of them, and you have to keep in mind always that it's also a kind of detour that de Brosses is making to fight against all kinds of religions. So I'm just reading and discussing at the same time. First section, on the present fetishism of the Negroes and of other savage nations. The Negroes of the west coast of Africa, and even those of the interior of the continent as far as Nubia, the land adjacent to Egypt. So it's Egypt is the main, the canon in a way, and around which everything is organized in European modern mind that tries to address the question of Africa. So the land adjacent to Egypt have as objects of worship certain divinities that the Europeans, and he goes there a couple of pages after, I think 4 or 5 pages later, he goes there to the real origin of fetish, because he said that the Europeans call it fetishes. But what he assumed before it was that it was an African local word, and what we can understand from that is that it has become probably a local world in the kind of encountering and transaction and trade that existed in between European and Africans at this time. So that the Europeans call fetishes, a term coined by our traders in Senegal from the Portuguese word fetiço, which means fairy, enchanted, or divine thing, or giver of oracles. This from the Latin root fatum, fanum, fav. These divine fetishes are nothing other than the first material objects that each nation or individual has seen fit in to have ceremonially consecrated by his priests. So once again, we are at a level of generality, which is not so much specific to Africa, but it can be recognized, and it's in this sense, it's really a pioneering work of anthropology, which can be recognized in all kinds of human societies. At one point when an individual or a group of individuals worship any kind of objects, natural or handmade or anything, and have these objects sanctified, or how does it say that in English? Consecrated by a priest, it becomes a fetish. So a tree, a mountain, a sea, a piece of wood, and the list is very long. There are so many gods, sacred objects, and also talismans for the Negroes who worship them. So we have also a definition of paganism here: incarnation of the gods into material objects and plurality of the gods. So these are two main arguments, I think, in the work of de Brosses, and on which I've been basing my own presentation today. And I will give two other ones from Winckelmann, if I still have time, if it's okay for you. Yes? The first one, I read to go a little bit quicker, and I hope you have it on your screen. I'm not sure. Among the Egyptians, art did not advance much beyond its earliest style. So the first denial of history in artistic style or development. It did not advance in a way. And it could not easily have attained the heights that it did among the Greeks, the comparison with the Greek. The reasons for this lay partly in their physical appearance, partly in their way of thinking, and just as much in their customs and laws, especially those relating to religion. So, well, I go on. It also lay in their estimation of artists and in the technical knowledge artists possessed. This will be the subject of this first section. Among the reasons for the peculiarities of the Egyptian art, the first has to do with the appearance of the Egyptian people. A very huge conviction that beauty comes from imitating nature, and as far as people are not beautiful, there is not this emulation that can be given to artists to stimulate their way of representing nature. So which did not have that excellence needed to inspire the artists to ideas of high beauty, for nature were less favorable to them than to the Etruscans and the Greeks, as reflected in a Chinese cast to the Egyptian physique, both in statues and on obelisks and engraved gems. Thus, their artists could not seek variety. Exactly the same appearance is evident in the heads of the persons painted on mummies, which, as among the Ethiopians, and that's where I want you to be to pay attention to the fact that in the thinking of Winckelmann, there can be a connection with the eastern part of the sub-Saharan Africa, but not with the western one. And actually, so I finish this express. As among the Ethiopians, probably were accurate likenesses of the deceased, for in preparing dead bodies, the Egyptians sought to preserve everything that could make them recognizable down to the eyelashes. Perhaps the Ethiopian custom of painting the shape of the deceased on the body came from the Egyptians as well, for during the reign of Psammetichos, 240,000 inhabitants left Egypt for Ethiopia, where they introduced their mores and customs. It might also be noted that 18 Ethiopian kings ruled over Egypt in its earliest period. The Egyptians, moreover, were a dark brown complexion, just as rendered on the heads of painted mummies. So there is two paradoxical. So, at one point, we can, by reading Winckelmann, we can feel how much the question of the Mediterranean banks are making a wall, which is over the question of the continentality of Africa, and authorizes to divide, to distinguish in a way, west coast or Atlantic coast of Africa and all the slave trade from Egyptian antiquity. But at the same time, he's connecting it to the Ethiopian area. And what it explains, I think, what can be a kind of explanation, or what it opens, even if it's not thoughtful from Winckelmann, is that maybe the race was not the main problem. The main problem was to be connected to a place where slavery was prominent in a way. And it was not a question of the brown complexion of the Egyptian, but not to be able to introduce as the first phase of the history of ancient art, that it was in a way connected to the question of slavery, because the question of liberality was so important. And that's how I'm coming to the last excerpt, where we can read how is envisaged by Winckelmann the question of liberality. And I read it here. Greek philosophy was reared on this soil, and the first historians were from this land, so Greece, of course. Even Apelles, the painter of the Graces, was engendered in this voluptuous climate. But these Greeks, because they were unable to defend their freedom against the myths of their nearby Persians, were unable to constitute themselves as powerful free states, as the Athenians did, and for this reason the arts and sciences did not have their most distinguished seat in Ionic Asia. So he's separating the Athenians from the other populations of Greece in Ionic Asia. In Athens, however, where after the expulsion of the tyrants, a democratic form of government was adopted in which the whole people participated. The spirit of every citizen soared and the city rose above all the Greeks. As good taste was now widespread and as wealthy citizens sought by means of splendid buildings and works of art to inspire the respect and love of their fellow citizens and to pave the way to honor, everything flowed into this city with its power and greatness like rivers into the sea. Here, the arts settled alongside the sciences, established themselves. Here, they took their principal seat, and from here they spread to other lands. That the growth of the arts in Athens can be attributed to the reason cited is attested by similar circumstances in Florence, where in modern times the arts and sciences started to shine after a long period of darkness. So it's very clear that the question of liberal arts is connected to a political environment, a political context connected to democracy. And it's the freedom of the citizenship, in a way, will give the kind of art that can be so accomplished as the one of the Greek in the time of Athens. And it's from this time, or from this political context, that will be possible the spread of a canon, which is the Greek one, and its revival in the narrative of Winckelmann. So I hope it's not too much confused, but I wanted just to read a little bit of their text because it has no sense otherwise, and I hope you didn't lose through this time my own argumentation. I thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was really brilliant. It's so nice to actually go into these texts in detail and to be talked through the way you're thinking about them. So that was really illuminating.